Hello, my name is Ian Koss, and as the Bay Area Rapid Folders Group likes to say, they're a folding society, I fold under pressure. I've been interested in origami for a long time, but as it turns out, the history of origami goes on a lot longer than that. So let's start out.
You may have to sit there and just move it along. Yeah, that's the best. You just have to tell me I'm sorry.
Wish I had that. Okay. So let's start with the basics. What is origami? Most of us hear that question and we think of something kind of like this, you know, the ancient Japanese art of paper folding. Origami, after all, is derived from the Japanese words for folded paper, and the traditional crane, which is historically Japanese model, is always associated with it. And of course, we know the stories of 1,000 cranes. The library is involved in one of those projects trying to put together 1,000 cranes. But it's not exactly that. Actually, there are several known traditions of folding paper, but there's little historical evidence because folded paper is not something that lasts through the years, like sculpture or oil painting or all sorts of other forms of art. So really what we have to go on for the history of origami is some books that have reference to them and some images here and there. Even the experts are unsure, and they started their research before yesterday afternoon, like I did. So despite this lack of hard evidence, I kind of put together several agreed upon facts and tried to put them in chronological order and come up with a narrative for the history of this art form. All right. So we're going to start with the first of three periods that I have defined by myself and some of you are sharing them. The first is traditional origami, and we're going to go right to the start. 105 AD in China, paper is invented. Those are some ancient ruins of an old paper making facility, and here's some prints that have survived from that period. Supposedly, paper was invented by Cai Yun, who was a senior court official for Emperor Sing. He used fibers from bark, rags, and old fishing nets for his invention of paper. Yes, The picture is like an old paper making facility in China. Alright, so there is a Chinese paper folding tradition. It has its own character. It deals with inanimate objects. They fold things like houses and simulated gold bricks. And these are burned as representations of objects in funerals. So that's how the Chinese incorporated into their folding. So the Chinese managed to hang on to this great secret of paper for about 5 centuries. And then it starts coming out of China, and it's brought to Japan in the 6th century AD by a Buddhist monk as led to the Taoism. Kind of came through Korea and ended up in Japan. This is some artwork from me. This is a sculpture from here. The Japanese tradition is more of decorative forms, and it's used in ceremonies like weddings. There are traditional butterflies that are folded for the bride and weddings.
They're asking me.
or a significant decoration, like something you could put on a gift to identify you as the giver. But it is definitely a different tradition from Chinese. Okay. A couple hundred years go by, and in a place called Samarkand, which is now in Uzbekistan, it was an important location along the Silk Road, which was where goods flowed from east to west and back again. This city was taken by Arabs, and the Chinese tried to take it back, and the Arabs took prisoners, took Chinese prisoners. And from those prisoners, the secret of paper, the process for making paper, came to the Arab world. And then back along the Silk Route, the Arabs took paper to Central Asia and Eastern Europe and all the way into Europe. All right, so here we are in the 15th to 17th centuries. We have a folding tradition in Europe at this point. There is there's a tradition of folded napkins that are used as status symbols for fancy dinners. You display your status by having the most fancy folded napkin in the individual pattern. That's an art form that lasted a couple of centuries and then died out around the 18th century. People think that it's because porcelain plates were invented, and then became the new status symbol, and the napkin was just something on the side. At the same time, we have, stick around chronologically. This, it's kind of hard to see here. You can see one of the first references of what people think is an origami boat in a boat written in the 13th century. Some people say it's an origami boat, some people say it's just a boat that kind of looks like it could be an origami boat. Another folding tradition is these are certificates that are given by godparents to their godchild when they're born, and they're folded in a specific pattern, and it's a German tradition. All right. Meanwhile, that tradition is going strong in Japan, and in the 18th and 19th century, we begin to see the first publication of books about origami. There are artifacts from before then, paintings that show it and such, but these are kind of the first instruction manuals. And you can see how they had a frame. They had some modular origami. So people think that boxes over there in the corner. The boat. This is a book that shows you how to make frames that are joined together on pieces of paper that are cut incompletely. Okay. Next. All right. Does anyone know who Friedrich Frobel is? No. He's kind of an unusual person to see here. Friedrich Frobel was born in 1782 in Germany, and he's widely credited as the inventor of kindergarten. That's why kindergarten is a German word. He proposed the idea that children could develop valuable skills at an earlier age, that they would be taught to read and such, mostly through play activities. One of those activities that he incorporated into his curriculum was paper folding. And interestingly enough, his type of paper folding has some very basic rules. You would start with a square. It would be colored on one side and not the other, and you were not allowed to cut it. If you've been folding origami, you'll recognize these rules as the rules of what people call pure origami. But it's interesting to note that they came from Germany and not Japan. And my theory is that these rules are directly descended from the napkin folding, because a napkin is a square, and you can't cut up that napkin or you're not going to be able to use it again. Okay, next slide. 1868.
Yeah.
Japan undergoes what people call the Meiji Restoration. Up until then, Japan had been pretty much a closed, isolated country. They did not trade with other countries. They basically kept to themselves and lived as they had for a long time. But when the U.S. Navy came to visit one day and the Japanese went out in their little boats to meet them, they kind of realized something was not right. So they opened up to the rest of the world and they aggressively began importing things from the West that they thought would help them catch up. Things like kindergarten. So in this way, the paper folding tradition was kind of came back around and was reintroduced to Japanese chipsets. Meanwhile, back in Europe, we have Leo Tolstoy, who wrote an essay called "What is Art?" that contains this quote that I found fascinating. I don't know if you can read it there, but it says, "This winter, a lady of my acquaintance taught me how to make cockerels by folding paper, so that when you pull their pails, they flap their wings. This invention comes from Japan." So it's kind of interesting to see that reference there, that already, even before the start of the 20th century, it was becoming a worldwide art. And that brings us to the next point in our timeline, what I call popular origami. In 1911, a man called Akira Yoshizawa was born in Japan. And origami in Japan at the time was not really a respected tradition. I mean, it had its place in ceremonies, and it was something that mothers taught their children, but no one really considered it an art. He didn't agree with that, and he basically worked for 20 years going door to door selling the condiment made from seaweed to support himself, before the rest of Japan caught on to what he was doing and started allowing him to make a living from his origami. He is kind of the Leonardo da Vinci of origami. He folded over 50,000 models by some estimate, but there's only a couple thousand that have been diagrammed and kept restricted. He was also very radical in that he did not use cuts, because until then, most Japanese origami did not care whether you cut the paper or not. It was a means to get that figure at the end. And he also introduced new bases to the art form, because until then, there were only a handful of different ways you could start an origami. You can think of the way chess is played. Now, there's really only a handful of moves of the game to start out with. So he went out there and he came up with all sorts of crazy opening. Okay. 1945. There is an American humorist named Gershon Legman. He is known as a fine author of Dirty Limericks. Here's kind of a little cleaned up one for you. If you look him up, you can see what he was about. He broke his ankle. And while he's recovering in the hospital, he becomes interested in paper folding, and he kind of catches the bug. And he became kind of a catalyzing force in that he was the first person outside of Japan who went to research origami and who found Yoshizawa, and who began, bringing what he was doing outside of Japan. Okay, 1965 in the United Kingdom, a magician and origamist named Robert Harding publishes a book called Paper Magic, and it begins a very prolific career of writing origami books. It's kind of the introduction of the art form to the public for a lot of people through Robert Harvin's book. He was a very interesting man. He was originally born in South Africa, emigrated to the UK where he began working as an illusionist. He was the first televised British illusionist back in 1937. He was the first Westerner to identify his art as origami, to use the Japanese word for it. And he was one of the developers, along with Yoshizawa and an American named Sam Randlett, of the diagramming system that we use today, so that to convey to each other how to fold a particular model. And his book, Secrets of Origami, is a book I threw a tantrum on back when I was 4. Okay, next. 1970, the Ron Resch paper and stick film. This is kind of an anachronism, because what this film shows a man named Ron Resch doing in 1970 didn't really become established in origami until 25 years later. Ron Resch was a computer scientist at the University of Iowa. He had a lot of interest in geometry. He was one of the people who pioneered the concept of computer-aided design. And he actually, I think, designed the first object being manufactured entirely using a computer. Specifying the points on a CAD program, producing things, putting it together. It's like, it looks kind of like a Fabergé egg. It's really wow. All right, so I've gotten stuck in this popular origami era just because of the date that this film was made. You can go to the Vimeo website and find this film in its entirety. It's about 45 minutes long. It's fascinating to see what this guy was doing. Okay, so that brings us to the thing I consider modern origami. Starting in the late 70s when John Montrol published his first book, and kind of going on to the end of the 80s, John Montrol and Jun Megawa were introducing a lot of new mathematical ideas into paper folding. They would create bases that would be used just for a single model and not reused to make something else. For example, John Montrol has a mountain goat and an antelope, and both of those, even though they look very similar, are folded in completely different ways. And they took this concept of pure origami in new mathematical directions. Okay, which brings us to the early 1990s and the bug wars, which, if you're a fan of origami, you have heard of the bug wars. You've heard of the bug wars, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a very interesting book that multiple other people have contributed to where I cannot from it and
yeah. So the bug wars are very interesting. They started at an annual convention of one of the largest origami societies in Japan. One of the conventions that was so large that it actually attracted people from the West. And basically someone would show up with some fantastic insect they had made, and everyone would spend the next year trying to figure out how to make something that topped it. So when the next convention came around, everyone would show their bugs and it was a spirit of competition, but they would also share their techniques, everyone would use everyone's techniques for the next year, and everything kind of built up from there. And there was a lot of innovation that came out of this. It kind of gave way and established a man named Robert J. Lang, who is another very interesting character. We'll find lots of interesting characters in origami. Dr. Lang is not the hockey player. There's apparently a famous hockey player named Robert Lang. He has a PhD in physics, I believe. He has something like 14 patents to his name with lasers. He worked for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, which is a really cool place to work for, if you know what that is. And he just gave it all up. He just gave it all up to do origami full time. He not only developed new models, but developed new theories and mathematical models of how paper is folded. And he wrote software to, based on those models. That's kind of what you see there on the left is tree maker software running on some old version of the Mac. But it would allow you to specify what kind of base you wanted for your animal or whatever you were folding. And it would let you design the actual crease pattern. All right, and that brings us to the internet. Of course, the internet has changed a lot of things, and origami was not spared at all. It's a place for sharing ideas and inspiration. It's a place for organizing virtual and real-world gatherings. These bug wars that would take place once a year can now take place, 3 times a day. And probably most importantly, there's resources for everyone. Anyone that wants to learn origami doesn't just have a book to go from. They have instructional videos. You can go online and get origami supplies, get special paper for some project that you have in mind. It's really made it very easy to get very much into origami. Which kind of brings us to where we are today. These are some interesting models. This one here is by Brian Chan, and it's an origami representation of the logo for MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This is a mask folded by a man named Joel Cooper. It's a tessellation. He kind of works with bleeding the paper and pushing parts out and making it 3D. This one I made myself. You can see some of them over there. I call them tiki towers. I'm not sure what it is. It's kind of a corrugation. Okay, so here are some techniques that have kind of come up in the last 20 years and some samples. We have wet folding. Their art of the time was comprised entirely of geometric patterns. So the Alhambra is this fort that is decorated top to bottom with tiles and inlays and all sorts of crazy geometry. And Chris Palmer, who was kind of a broke college student, I guess, lived in a cave outside of town and would go by day into the Alhambra and just wander around with a sketchbook, drawing pictures. And because he could not afford paper, he would fold all his designs in linen. He would try his designs in linen, and when he was done, he would just open it up and be done for the next one. A man named Eric Gerde, it's a difficult name to pronounce. This is one of his patterns. It's kind of very difficult to see from over there. But he has published a book. He has been very instrumental in getting information out there and instruction for people who are interested in this type of origami. And as I said, there's Joel Cooper, who will take flat paper and make these three-dimensional masks out of lattices. Okay, we have kind of a small area that is just getting defined, and that's called corrugations. And these are models that use a type of pleating, a type of back and forth folding to give them shape and structure. I do a lot of these. You can see some of them again in the display case over there. There's a man called Ray Shamp who has done a lot of mathematical investigation of how corrugations work, and he can come up with some interesting models. Okay, next. Computational origami. this is not just folding paper. There's no real paper involved here, or actually the only real papers involved are the ones that people are publishing about origami. Here is it? Yes. The last interesting character of the evening. Eric Domain grew up homeschooled, wandering around the country, got his bachelor's at age 12, got his doctorate by age 20. Now he teaches at MIT, computer science, supplies. And here you can see a picture of some of his class notes for his for origami constructible numbers. I'm not sure what he's talking about, but there's also a Japanese astrophysicist named Koryo Miura, who has come up with a design for folding large flat things into small compact things, which is very useful if you have something like a satellite antenna or a solar panel, which is very flat and very fragile and still has to be put on a rocket and blasted off the Earth. So he used his origami visualization to come up with a way that an antenna could be folded up into a very small space and unfold itself with a very simple mechanism, because you want things to be as simple as possible. And his designs have been used in several satellites already, and in probably many places that we're not even aware of yet. Okay. And finally, we have, the catch-all category that I call experimental origami. There's always something new happening. Someone always has a new idea to try. Here's an example of someone using curved folds. Who would have thought you could make curved folds, but you can, and you get some interesting results. All right. And then finally, the future. What does it fold? We don't really know. Origami is something that constantly surprises me, and I see a lot of it. At home, we have a screensaver on the TV that goes out to Flickr, and it does a search on the keyword origami, and it just brings in fresh pictures every day. And every day I see something that makes me wonder how they did that. How did someone come up, how did someone invent this in the first place? And then, having invented it, how did they get it out of their head and into something you can hold in your hand? We are only beginning to see scientific applications of origami. Like you saw with computational origami, there's a lot of theoretical applications, a lot of mathematical applications, but there are also a lot of practical applications, a lot of engineering applications of origami, like with the satellite antennas. It's hard to say where all of this will go. And that concludes my presentation. Yes,
Professor Koss. Question. You mentioned the applications. Have you heard anyone using like graphene sheets, origami applications for like graphene for batteries or anything like that?
There are a lot of applications in nanotechnology for origami because of the simplified nature of things at that scale. Suddenly things like folding a certain sequence of folds, creating something that will execute that sequence of folds is an engineering possibility by the time you get to being able to manipulate things at that scale. And there's applications for folding proteins, for example. It's not instantly obvious, but if you know anything about proteins, you know that there are billions of ways that these molecules combine. And if you can have the exact same arrangement, the exact same number of atoms in this molecule as in a different molecule, but because it is shaped a little differently, it is now poison to the human body instead of something that is completely harmless. There are applications for origami that apply directly here.
That stuff that was like accordion pleated, what do you call that again?
Corrugation?
Corrugation.
corrugated cardboard.
Okay, well, it was strange because this Christmas I had a bunch of very delicate Christmas ornaments shipped to me that were blown glass, and they were all packed in this strange paper that looked like that. And I started to try to use it for repacking, and as I unspindled it, it was just flat paper. And it's been pierced in multiple places, and an accordion pleated to become super awesome packing paper. And so it's kind of a low-tech, technical way of using it.
Yeah, there's, I mean, there are so many applications, and sometimes we don't even realize that, you know, a new design for our box of cereal, it has a twist that was added by someone who knows about origami and decided they could incorporate this fold to save the company, you know, 5 million metric tons of cardboard every year, just from being able to remove a glue flap. Anyone else? Yes?
I'm a preschool teacher, and we do a lot of die cutting, and there are a lot of patterns that have the perforated parts that you can turn into flowers and stuff like that. Is that considered origami, or is that just cheating?
You know, it's going to come down to a person's opinion.
Okay.
I mean, I think if you're taking paper and you're shaping it in folds, you can probably call it origami. If you want to argue over whether you have to use a square or you can use a rectangle, or you know whether you're allowed to use scissors or not, or have the paper perforated beforehand, I don't think it's really that important. I think what matters is the end result. And I mean, sometimes people will value the end result more if it's more like a magic trick, you know. Like for example, when I take one of these sheets of paper and I'm waiting in the bank, waiting to be called, and you know, I'll just start folding and waiting, and you know, out of nothing, you transform it into something else, and people are impressed. Wow, if you have something like perforated paper or things like that, they might want to take the points off, but I don't think it matters. I think in the end, what you fold is what you fold.
I'm not very good at it either way.
It doesn't matter. Probably one of the most important things I've learned about origami, at least for myself, is that origami is about the process. It's not about the product. The value of origami is the type of meditation you get out of sitting there and folding paper repeatedly. And when you're done, yes, you have something you can give to your friends or keep around the house or whatever, but really, you know, if you know me, you know that I'll be working on a model and I'll be telling everyone about it, and as soon as it's done, it's done. You know, it sits somewhere in the house and gathers dust, and we'll give it away, and it's time to move on to the next one. Yes?
Speaking of which, how do you go from, I mean, you mentioned, you know, buying other people's books when you were born, exploring for that, and I sort of had the internet equivalent of that. But how do you go from that and like aping other people's designs and just, you know, following the directions that other people give you to designing your own work?
I mean, you know, that's one. It's all comes down to creativity. You can learn all sorts of techniques from other people, and you can apply them to your own models. But really, if you're trying to get kind of jump started on that kind of thing, I would start with a model that you have instructions for, and then think to yourself, well, what is something similar to this that will require some modification? You know, maybe you want to change that model of a tiger into a model of a lion. And now you need to figure out how you're going to take that corner of paper that will become the tiger's head and get a lion's mane out of it. And that's when you really start developing the ability to visualize for yourself instead of having the instructions visualize for you what's going to happen and how it's going to look. It becomes kind of the difference between being able to read music and being able to have someone take that sheet music away from you and just improvise something that kind of works out. More questions? No? All right, well, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I hope you learned something new. I sure did. It is not as simple as the ancient art of Japanese paperboard. And if you are interested in giving it a try, again, turn to the internet. There's videos for anything you might want to try as well. And I hope you enjoy learning this in the past.
Hey guys, thanks for coming. And while you're here, make sure you take a look at the origami that's on display if you haven't already, and eat some cookies.